Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's getting out of hand, really, you know. Your coffee, sir.
Thank you, pal.
Johnny, I'm telling you, there's just too many of these migrants everywhere, you know. Look, I'm not racist, but they have to abide by our laws and stuff. They should be grateful that we give them jobs, you know what I'm saying? My great-grandfather did not come to this country to build this nation from scratch, so that now they can come here and I thought you got a green card through marriage a couple of weeks ago. Well, let's just have an apple pie, shall we? An apple pie.
Excuse me, pal?
Have you ever had a conversation with someone who shares a similar sentiment with the guy in the Hawaiian shirt? It feels like they're trying to say something but don't have the right words to phrase it. But when you listen carefully, you understand that they are trying to express an opinion that might be somewhat intolerant. The way we talk about politics and social matters is connected to a certain ideology. And to better understand what the guy in the Hawaiian shirt tried to say, let's take a closer look at the ideology of civic nationalism. When I first heard the term civic nationalism, I thought it was all about a bunch of Nazis driving Honda Civics, but it turned out to be more complicated than that. To understand the idea of civic or liberal nationalism, we first need to recall the origins of nationalism and the concept of good old ethnic nationalism. Nationalism is an ideology which gives great importance to the concept of nation. But what is a nation? Different versions of nationalism define this term differently, but generally a nation is a group of people who live in a certain territory, speak the same language, and share similar culture and traditions. Actually, it gets a bit more complicated, but we will return to this later. In modern history, nationalist ideas were first manifested during the French Revolution and the American War of Independence. Until the end of the 18th century, Europe was mainly composed of empires and feudal kingdoms ruled by monarchs. The source of legitimacy for monarchs was the so-called divine right of kings. According to this concept, monarchs were appointed to rule by God, and so they were not obliged to answer for their actions before any mortals, be it aristocrats or people of lower classes. But during the Age of Enlightenment, new political ideas were developed. One of the essential ideas was that the only true source of sovereignty must be the people, the nation. In 1776, the colonies of North America decided not to obey the King of Britain anymore. So they declared independence and then fought a war to establish their own state. And then they wrote a musical about it. The French were also fed up with their king, so in 1789 they started a revolution, abolished monarchy, and beheaded Louis XVI. These historic events were practical applications of the idea that sovereignty mustn't be assigned to just one person on the throne, but to the unity of people who live in the country. With numerous exceptions like women and slaves, of course. Then, during the 19th century, nationalist ideas truly took a giant leap forward when numerous wars of independence broke out around the globe. Spanish-American Wars of Independence, Greek War of Independence, the Polish uprisings against the Russian Empire, to name just a few. During the wave of revolutions in Europe in 1848 and 1849, many other national movements emerged across Europe. For instance, there was the Austrian Empire at the time, and it was populated by various nationalities, including Austrians, Hungarians, Poles, Czechs, Croats, Slovaks, and many more. In 1848-1849, many of them tried to gain independence from Austria. Probably the best-known revolution of that era is the Hungarian uprising, which was suppressed in 1849 by Austrians with the help of the Russian army sent by the Emperor Nicholas I. I mainly mentioned the national movements which sought independence from empires, but actually there were others which sought unification. As an example, during the same time period of 1848-1849, the population of 39 separate German states rebelled against their monarchs. Among other things, like freedom of assembly and freedom of the press, the revolutionaries demanded the unification of separated German states as one country. The German revolutions failed, but the idea of German unification remained highly influential, and in 1871 the separated German states were eventually unified by Bismarck, and the German Empire was created. Another example is Italy. In the beginning of the 19th century, there were a dozen different states on the Italian peninsula. The consolidation of these states into a single country was a lengthy process which took several decades and involved rebellions and wars. In 1861, the unified Italian state was proclaimed, called the Italian Kingdom. And in 1870, the Italian army captured Rome, which belonged to the Papal States. The unification of Italy was finished. Some of the national movements I mentioned were successful and some were not. But what's important is that many people across different nations started to share a similar sentiment. We want to unite based on our common national identity and do things our way. For example, if we're all Germans and if we all speak German, why can't we just stick together and build our own country? The answer to this question was the creation of nation-states. A nation-state is basically a sovereign country with one predominant ethnic group. I feel that today a nation-state is basically what we think of when we think of any country. For example, in France the majority of people are French, in Sweden the majority of people are Swedes, etc. Of course, the genesis of countries and borders as we know them today is more complicated, and there's a great video about it by Tom Nicholas. I will leave the link in the description. Still, nationalist ideas made a large contribution to the emergence of nation-states. Among other factors, the idea of national unity helped change the map of Europe from this to this. Obviously, nationalist ideas had a great influence on politics and international relations, but they influenced art and culture as well. The beginning of the 19th century was the era of Romanticism in European culture, and nationalism was one of the ideas which greatly inspired this artistic movement. Artists witnessed numerous national movements across Europe and were deeply impressed by the struggle for national unification and independence. They started exploring folk culture and using it as a source of inspiration for their own art. This branch of Romanticism, inspired by nationalism, is known as Romantic nationalism. Dutch cultural historian Leerssen defined it as the celebration of the nation defined by its language, history and cultural character as an inspiring ideal for artistic expression, and the instrumentalization of that expression in ways of raising the political consciousness. German philologists, Brothers Grimm, collected and published a compilation of German folk tales. Composer Richard Wagner wrote the opera Tannhäuser based on the medieval German legends. Frédéric Chopin used traditional folk melodies for his fantasy on Polish airs in A major, opus number 13. Norwegian Hans Gude created beautiful paintings of idyllic Norwegian landscapes. These are just a few examples of Romantic nationalism in art, but at that time artists of almost any European nation tried to explore, interpret and articulate the folk culture of their nation. Okay, now that we understand the origins of nationalism in general, let's go back to the essence of nationalism as an ideology. So, in nationalism, an essential political unit is a nation. But what is a nation? Who is a part of nation and who is not? It may be hard to give just one answer to this question. The thing is, there are numerous types of nationalism, and each of them defines a nation differently. Conservative nationalism, left-wing nationalism, national anarchism, national Bolshevism, eco-nationalism, and many, many more. Some nationalist ideologies are more moderate and inclusive, while some others are more radical and exclusive. Let's concentrate on ethnic nationalism as one of the major forms of nationalism. In ethnic nationalism, a nation is a group of people who share common heritage, which usually includes a common language, a common religion, and a common ethnic ancestry. This is a neat little definition, but like many definitions, it sounds a bit vague. How can we understand this concept better? Here is what historian Jerry Muller wrote about it. Ethnonationalism draws much of its emotive power from the notion that the members of a nation are part of an extended family, ultimately united by ties of blood. It is the subjective belief in the reality of a common we that counts. So, a nation is like a big family, but actually it's so big that sometimes we don't really know if certain people are part of our family or not. Muller writes, "The markers that distinguish the in-group vary from case to case and time to time, and the subjective nature of the communal boundaries has led some to discount their practical significance. So what does it mean? Ethnonationalism says that a nation is a group of people who speak the same language, believe in the same God, and belong to one ethnicity. But when it comes to more specific features of national identity, well, it's just vibes. If you pass the vibe check, then you belong to the nation, and if you don't, you don't. The vibes vary across different nations and different eras, and sometimes the vibes can get extreme. Let's imagine that a society is a bowl of multicolored pasta. The pasta pieces of different colors coexist peacefully, sharing the same environment. Then, one piece of white pasta says, "Guys, this is all great, but in our society we don't have any values. Our bowl is okay, but we forgot who we are. We are the descendants of the great pasta of the past, and we need to preserve our heritage." And other pieces of pasta are like, "Yeah, this sounds cool, we need to remember who we are." So they become a bit hyped up about this idea. Then the white pasta piece says, "Actually, you know what? The greatest of all pasta was the white pasta, and we should be proud of our ancestry." The white pasta pieces are very fond of this idea, and the colored pasta pieces are like, "Well, okay." The white pasta pieces then realize that they are actually very different from all the other pasta pieces, and gradually they even start believing that white pasta is superior to colored pasta. With this in mind, they begin to change the political climate of their bowl. They start treating colored pasta pieces worse because, well, colored pasta does not deserve the same things as white pasta, this is just a fact. They proceed to discriminate colored pasta and to gradually exclude it from the society. At some point, white pasta pieces also start wearing stylish black uniforms and greeting each other with the pasta salute. And then, the famous piece of white pasta gives a speech again and says, "In fact, colored pasta is not pasta at all, because traditionally, pasta has always been white, and bringing color to pasta was an evil plan constructed by tomatoes and other vegetables to undermine the basics of pasta civilization. And we need to do anything to defend the interests of our nation, because it's either us or them." Now, it takes just one final step to implement the final solution of the colored pasta question. Okay, let's talk liberal nationalism now. First of all, the terms liberal nationalism and civic nationalism are interchangeable, so please don't get confused. Liberal or civic nationalism is another major form of nationalism, which is usually seen as an alternative to ethnic nationalism. In liberal nationalism, a nation is conceptualized differently. It is not the shared language or ethnicity that counts, but rather the common ideals that the members of the nation agree to support. So it can be relatively easy to determine who is a part of a nation and who is not. If you share the values of our nation, then welcome, and if you don't, well, come back later. But when you think about it, it gets a bit more complex. What exactly are those shared values of any specific nation? Who shape those values? Well, the common values in civic nationalism are liberal values, such as the right to democratic participation, freedom of expression, toleration of differences, etc. Those who want to join a nation are expected to respect these liberal democratic principles. The next question is, how do I demonstrate that I really share these values? The procedure differs across different countries. For example, in America, there is a citizenship test, including questions on American history, government, and symbols. And in Australia, they even have an official document listing the Australian values, derived from liberal ideology: respect for the freedom and dignity of the individual, freedom of religion, commitment to the rule of law, and others. All migrants to Australia are required to sign the Statement of Australian Values to get a visa. Liberal nationalism is undoubtedly more inclusive than ethnic nationalism, and generally, civic nationalism sounds like a great ideology. You can be a part of a nation if you share the liberal democratic ideals of that nation, that's cool. It sure looks great on paper, but is it actually that good in practice? One of the problems of civic nationalism is that it doesn't guarantee the proper integration of new members into a society, because civic integration policy often fails to provide specific mechanisms for it. Liberal nationalism reflects the self-representation of the nation itself, but it doesn't provide the grounds for integration. In other words, civic integration policies are more about who gets in rather than how they are integrated. For all my comrades out there, there's also a leftist argument against liberal nationalism. The thing is, liberalism in general promotes itself as a non-violent ideology, but it's not always so. Liberalism fosters freedom, equal rights, and democratic participation for all. But throughout history, it made numerous exceptions when it was profitable. Why? In order to keep the capitalist machine going, as liberalism has always been intertwined with capitalism. Those whose labor was exploited were always denied equal rights, and it's also the case with migrants in modern societies. The principles of liberal nationalism can be used as an excuse to not fully integrate labor migrants into a society, so that they can stand up for their rights. There is actually a grand video on liberalism and capitalism by PhilosophyTube. You can find the link in the description. Civic nationalism can also become a disguise for the supporters of ethnic nationalism. In a society which claims to be liberal and tolerant, ethnonationalist views are not something to flex with, right? So, people who aren't especially fond of certain ethnicities adopted a new language to express their views. They still don't want to accept immigrants to their nation, but to justify it, they use new grounds for exclusion. For example, there is a notion that Muslims come from an allegedly uncivic culture, and so they will more likely break the law and won't properly integrate into a civilized, liberal democratic society. Let's bring up the pasta metaphor again. In the context of ethnic nationalism, one could say, this piece of pasta doesn't belong to our nation because it has a different color and it's made of a different type of flour. This statement is very clear, but may not be very acceptable. So, this person can use the language of liberal nationalism and say something like, this piece of pasta is more likely to break our laws and disrespect our values because it is made of a different type of flour. And this may even pass as a reasonable explanation of one's prejudices against other ethnicities. Speaking of ethnic prejudice, liberal nationalism doesn't really help reduce it in the first place. The problem is that by promoting universal civic values, it tends to ignore the importance of any ethnic differences at all. Where there are ethnic conflicts and discrimination, civic nationalism offers a panacea of shared civic values. And common liberal democratic values are great, but they can serve as an instrument for resolving problems which are rooted in ethnic differences and unequal power relations. Shared values are a result of nation building, not a tool for it. And thinking that having common values is enough to solve the issue of ethnic inequality only helps to avoid addressing this problem. As Israeli politician and academic Tamir wrote, this phenomenon is often obscured by the civic language that pushes identity to the margins of the political sphere, allowing politicians and theorists to paint an ideal picture that seeks to make conflict go away. Maybe you've heard the phrase, "I don't see race" before. When people say this, they mean that today it's not really important what your skin color or ethnic background is, because we're all equal and our ethnic differences are not a big deal. I think that this belief has a lot in common with the ideology of liberal nationalism. Denying the importance of skin color implies that there is something more significant which unites us. For example, shared values, occupation, interests, etc. This notion may sound reasonable for those who constitute an ethnic majority. But we need to remember that social reality is subjective, and the way you perceive it depends on what social group you belong to. The major factor is experience. Ethnic minorities are more likely to face discrimination in a million of different situations on a daily basis. And because of that, they are typically more aware of systemic discrimination than those who belong to an ethnic majority. And what happens when these different perspectives collide? Well, there is a brilliant example of this in a 1969 episode of The Dick Cavett Show. Here, a black writer and activist, James Baldwin, and a white philosophy professor, Paul Weiss, debate discrimination in the US. Being a white man, Weiss denies the importance of race while analyzing the state of American society. He basically says, why do we still concentrate on skin color if people can unite based on other parameters, for example their profession? He addresses Baldwin with this question.
I have more in common with a black scholar than I have with a white man who's against scholarship. And you have more in common with a white author than you have with someone who's against all literature. So why must we always concentrate on color or on religion or this? There are other ways of connecting men.
In his response, Baldwin describes his personal experience related to discrimination and inequality. And having experienced it firsthand, you can't just suddenly start pretending that race doesn't matter anymore, because there are already many pre-existing power imbalances, and you have always been the victim of them. Ignoring the differences in skin color would mean ignoring the complicated issues which already exist around these differences, such as racism, discrimination, and inequality. So when Weiss says that we can just forget about skin color, Baldwin replies,
"You want me to make an act of faith, risking myself, my wife, my woman, my sister, my children, on some idealism which you assure me exists in America, which I have never seen?"
So skin color matters after all. If you belong to a privileged majority, then ignoring ethnic differences at least means being uninformed. And for the members of discriminated groups, forgetting about these differences can even be dangerous. Those who are oppressed have to adapt to the social environment around them in order to survive. And to suddenly start acting as if racial prejudices do not exist anymore means putting themselves at a significant risk. Saying "I don't see race" is somewhat similar to what liberal nationalism is trying to do, except with ethnic differences. Trying to substitute ethnic identity with the concept of shared values in order to create a tolerant society seems utopian at best and deceiving at worst. It seems to me that liberal nationalism is problematic because it is based on liberalism, which in itself is not a perfect ideology, to say the least. Liberalism is in fact exclusive, and liberal nationalism serves to justify this exclusiveness. As I see it, liberal nationalism serves as a convenient set of views for those who want to keep a nation somewhat exclusive and not be accused of bigotry at the same time. But I'm actually very curious to hear your opinion on liberal nationalism. Do you think it's useful for building a strong and prosperous nation? Or do you think it's rather all talk and no action? Or do you have any other hot takes? Please let me know what you think in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe to my channel. See you in the next video.